In this video from IT Free Training, I will be looking at the files that are used with Hyper-V. Understanding where these files are stored and what they are needed for will help you when you back up or move virtual machines and obtain the best performance you can out of your virtual machines. To start with, I will first look at the different file types that are used with Hyper-V. The first file type that I will look at is XML. This is used to define the configuration used in virtual machines and also the configuration used with checkpoints. The XML files themselves do not contain any physical data used by the virtual machine. They are used to tell Hyper-V where to find this data. For example, they would contain information about the virtual hardware used in the virtual machine and also where to locate the virtual hard disks that are used with the virtual machine. The next file type is VHD and VHDX files. These two file types contain the data from a virtual hard disk. If your virtual machine uses virtual hard disks, the XML file will store the location of the VHD or VHDX file that contains this data. VHD is the older file standard and VHDX file is the newer file standard. VHDX adds the ability to use larger virtual hard disks and improves reliability and performance. However, it does require Windows 8 or Windows Server 2012. The next file type is AVHD and AVHDX. These files store checkpoint data. When you create a checkpoint for the virtual machine, an AVHD file will be created if you are using VHD, and an AVHDX file will be created if you are using a VHDX to store your virtual hard disks. A checkpoint saves the current state of the virtual machine, including the memory used in the virtual machine, which can be used later to restore the virtual machine back to that state. The next file type used with virtual machines is the bin type. If you save the virtual machine, the memory from the virtual machine will be saved in a bin file. Saving the virtual memory effectively stops the virtual machine. The virtual machine can then be started again from where it was saved. This essentially provides the same functionality as checkpoints. However, creating checkpoints can reduce the performance of the virtual machine, whereas saving the state does not. The advantage of checkpoints is that you can have more than one, whereas saving the virtual machine essentially stops it, saves its state, and allows it to be started again at a later time. The last file type is VSV. VSV is also used when the virtual machine is put into a saved state. However, these are used for devices that are in use with the virtual machine. So, when a bin file is created, a VSV file will be created as well. I will now have a closer look at the files used with Hyper-V and where they are stored. To do this, I will open Hyper-V Manager. I have two virtual machines running on this server. If I right-click on the first virtual machine, I will select the option Export. Exporting the files required by the virtual machine will give us a good indication of what files are required to run a virtual machine. Once export has been selected, I will select the Documents folder on this computer and then press Export. Hyper-V is now exporting the virtual machine. Notice that the status of the virtual machine is listed as exporting and a percentage of how much is complete. The process takes a minute or two, so I will pause the video and return shortly. Now that the virtual machine has been exported, I will switch to Windows Explorer. You will notice that when I open the Documents folder, I have a document with the name of the virtual machine that I exported. If I open this folder, you will notice there are 3 more folders. If I open the folder Snapshots, you will notice that there are no files in this folder. This is because this virtual machine has not had any checkpoints created as yet. In previous versions of Hyper-V, checkpoints were referred to as snapshots, and thus the reason the folder is named Snapshots. If I now go back and open the Virtual Hard Disks folder, you will notice that there is one file in this folder, since this virtual machine has the one virtual hard disk. By default, Windows Explorer will not show the extension of this file. To show this, I will select the View menu, and then on the far right, select Options to bring up folder options. If I now select the View tab, I will untick the option Hide Extensions for Known File Types. Once I press OK, notice that the extension for the file, VHDX, has now appeared. So this virtual disk file is using the new virtual disk format supported by Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012 and above. If I now go back to the previous folder, I will next open the folder Virtual Machines. You can see in this folder there is the one XML file. This file contains the configuration for the virtual machine. You will also notice that the file name is named after the GUID of the virtual machine. The GUID is a unique number that is allocated to the virtual machine when it is created. You can see that to have a functional virtual machine, all that was needed was a configuration file and a virtual hard disk file. These were exported from the local server, so the next step is to have a look at where these files are stored on the local server and also the other file types that are used with virtual machines. If I now go back to Hyper-V Manager, I will right-click on the first virtual machine and then select the option Checkpoint. A checkpoint saves the current state of the virtual machine, allowing it to be restored to this state later on. This includes the current state of the memory and the contents of the virtual hard disk. You will notice that in this particular case, the virtual machine was not running. However, the checkpoint can still be created. To see how Hyper-V stores its files, I will select the option on the right-hand side, Hyper-V Settings. You will notice the first screen has the full file and a path of where the virtual hard disks are stored. I will now copy and paste this path into Windows Explorer. You will notice at the top is the VHDX file for the virtual machine. Under this is the AVHDX file that contains the checkpoint data. Each time you create a checkpoint, a new AVHDX file is created. These are just files on the local hard disk, so the question is, how does Hyper-V know where to find these files, and how does it know which checkpoint files are associated with each virtual machine? If I now go back into the Hyper-V Manager and open the Hyper-V settings, I will next select the second option down, Virtual Machines. This will show the folder where the data for the virtual machine will be stored. I will now copy and paste this path into Windows Explorer. You can see that in this folder there are a lot of subfolders. In most cases, only a few of these folders will be used. If I open the Snapshots folder, you will notice that there is an XML file in this folder. This contains the configuration data for the checkpoint. Remember that the data for the checkpoint was in the other folder, so this file only contains the configuration for that checkpoint. If I now go back to the previous folder, and then open the folder for Virtual Machines, you can see the XML file that contains the configuration data for the virtual machine. So you can see that configuration files are stored in one location, while the data from the virtual machines is stored in another location. Now let's go back to Hyper-V Manager. To demonstrate a point, I will right-click the first virtual machine and then select the Delete option to remove the virtual machine from the server. Once I have confirmed that this is what I want to do, the virtual machine appears to have been removed. If I now select the option on the right-hand side, Import Virtual Machine, this will launch the Import Virtual Machine wizard that will allow me to import the virtual machine that I exported earlier. Once I'm past the Welcome screen, on the next screen I need to browse to the location that I exported the virtual machine to earlier. Once selected, I will move to the next screen of the wizard. The next screen will state which virtual machines have been found, which in this case there is only one. On the next screen, a decision needs to be made on how the virtual machine should be imported. The first option will not copy or move the data files from their present location, but will use them in this location. In this case, I don't want to run the virtual machine from this location. The second option will restore the virtual machine to its default location, so I select this option. The last option will copy the virtual machine, but will create a new unique ID. You would use this option if you wanted to duplicate the virtual machine and did not want to risk having two virtual machines with the same unique ID. On the next screen, I need to decide where to store the virtual machine configuration and associated files. In this case, I will leave it on the default location and move on to the next screen. On the next screen, I need to decide where to store the virtual hard disks for the virtual machine. In this case, I will leave it on the defaults and move on. you will notice that I get an error message stating that the virtual hard disk already exists. If I change to Windows Explorer and go to the virtual hard disk folder, you will notice that the virtual hard disk file from the virtual machine is still present. In order to import the virtual machine, the virtual hard disk file needs to be removed. So I will now remove the file. It is important to remember this fact when removing a virtual machine. Even though the configuration files for the virtual machine have been removed, the virtual hard disk containing all the data from that virtual machine may still remain. Now that the virtual hard disk has been removed, I will now close this error message and move on to the next screen of the wizard. On the last screen of the wizard, I need to press the Finish button, and this will start the import. The process does take a little while to complete, so I will pause the video and return shortly. Now that the import has been completed, you will notice that the virtual machine is now listed with the other virtual machines. There are still two other file types that are used with virtual machines that I have not covered yet. To show these types of files, I will right-click the virtual machine that is currently running and select the option to pause. When a virtual machine is saved or paused, some additional files are created. If I go back to the Hyper-V settings, I will copy and paste the folder location for the virtual machines into Windows Explorer. To see the other file types, I will open the folder Virtual Machines. To see the remaining file types, I will need to open the folder that is named after the GUID of the virtual machine. In this folder, you will see a bin file. This file is a dump of the virtual machine when it was paused, so it should be the same size as the amount of memory the virtual machine has allocated to it. The file below this, the VSV file, contains a dump of the current state of the devices of the virtual machine. These files will only be created if the virtual machine is paused. If, for example, you create a checkpoint for a virtual machine, this will save the current state of the memory and the current state of the devices. However, it will not create bin or VSV files. These files are only created when a virtual machine is paused. To end this video, I will perform a quick summary of the major points. By default, the configuration files for virtual machines are stored in the following location. The main file is the XML file, which contains details about the virtual machines and also details about the checkpoints that are in use with the virtual machine. The folder also contains the bin and VSV files. These files are only used if the administrator pauses or saves the virtual machine, so you can see that the data that is stored in this file should be quite small. The next location is where the virtual hard disks are stored. These are the VHD and VHDX files. If you create a checkpoint for the virtual machine, another file will be created of the type AVHD or AVHDX, depending on which type of virtual hard disk is being used. As the administrator, you are free to change the default location of these files. It is important also to understand where these files are stored so that when you are backing up the virtual machines, the virtual machine's backup data and configuration files are backed up. I hope you've enjoyed this video from IT Free Training and found it useful. Please see our website or YouTube channel for more videos on this course and others. Thanks for watching.